Knight and Changeling, Chapter 19. Reassurance. Jen frowned, letting the curtain drop into place on the window. She thought she'd heard something outside, but shook her head as she turned back to George. He offered a bottle of wine. She shook her head. Not really my style. Doesn't do much for me either. George nodded.
Fair, though I recall that being most of what you would drink before.
Jen nodded. Water wasn't safe back then. I may not be the best history student, but I know that much. George poured himself a glass and stepped over to a small minibar, set into the back of the living room.
I have some sodas if you prefer, while we speak.
Jen nodded. That'd be great, thanks. He poured a root beer into a glass with some ice.
I have had some information on a possible physical manifestation of the Dagon, worshipped by a group called the Flamekeeper's Circle.
Jen took the glass he offered and shook her head. Already looked into it. Not a threat, but not the Dagon. An old enemy of mine, actually. Vilgax. In a form like one the Dagon could use. A giant squid thing. George nodded, sipping his wine.
It's good that it's not the Dagon itself. I've never heard of this Vilgax.
Jen nodded. You wouldn't. He's intergalactic, a warlord bent on obtaining the Omnitrix. He's a threat, but not back at full power since our last fight. I've got eyes on him. What about the book? George pulled it out from under the coffee table. He pressed a hand to the lock, and the book fell open. Jen smiled, running a finger over the lines as they blossomed. It no longer held the same fear it had when she hadn't known what it was. She'd done some research when she was stuck in the past. The book had reacted as it had to Stardust because she had created it originally. But no more did it place visions of wrath and death that had already occurred. Instead, black shimmering lines that had not dimmed with time sprouted under her fingers, forming the lines of a map. A single glowing red dot appeared. Jen traced the lines of the map and frowned. I don't recognize it. George nodded.
I do. In middle of France, near a lovely lilac field.
Jen nodded. Sounds beautiful.
George smiled. I hope you get to see it someday, but it won't be there long. I've spent many years after you vanished poring over this book. A pattern emerged after some time, though for the life of me I do not know how long it took me to find. Years, that much I know.
Jen nodded slightly. So, where will it show up next?
Somewhere here in California.
Jen nodded. Anything more specific? Cali's a big state, George. George nodded.
I know, I was there when it was founded.
Well, I was actually in Spain. Jen snorted into her drink. One of these days, I'm going to sit down with you and get you to tell me your whole life story. George gestured to a bookcase behind her.
I kept up with my journaling.
Jen glanced at the bookshelf. It was full of identically bound volumes. She raised an eyebrow.
I got bored and eventually took up bookbinding as a hobby. It takes up a lot of time, which is something I have in abundance.
Jen laughed lightly into her soda. So we wait. George nodded slightly.
For now, that's all we can do.
Jen shook her head, draining her glass. I hate waiting. He smiled at her.
That much I already knew. Let me show you around the house for now. We'll see about that horse race.
She grinned at him and set down her glass, nodding. Sounds like fun. She made her way home hours later, grinning widely and smelling like a horse. Hers was a young mare, still a bit wild, but willing to run in the miles of field that came with the house. She hopped into the shower and swapped into pajamas and was running a towel through her hair when her phone rang. She frowned. It was close to 2 a.m, but she always picked up for family. Gwen? A shaking breath met her over the phone. What's wrong? Jen asked, the towel slipping from her fingers. I'm fine. Her voice was shaking, though. Just a nightmare. Do you need me to come over? Jen asked. She wasn't sure what the answer would be. She knew she could go to Gwen if she needed to, but Gwen didn't often call with nightmares when they happened to her. No, I just wanted to check on you. Did I wake you up? Jen shook her head, picking up her towel. Nah, couldn't sleep. I just got out of the shower. Gwen nodded, sitting on the floor. The burning eyes in her dream seemed to still watch her from the shadows of her room. She couldn't shake off the feeling. It was worse tonight than it had been in a long time. Visions of a bloody and vicious murder haunted her, the culprit under her own skin. The victims laid out before her, Kevin with his armor split open and bloody, and Jen in pieces strewn across the ground around her, blood on her own hands. She was still shaking. But talking helped. Kevin was asleep on the bed, a heavy sleeper like she hadn't seen before. It helped having him breathing nearby, but not enough since Jen was absent. But hearing her breathing and speaking was stopping the shakes as Kevin snorted in his sleep. He reached out to where she normally rested and sat up, rubbing tired eyes.
"Gwen?"
he asked sleepily. She smiled slightly, her hands finally stilling. She heard muffled laughter over the line. "Is that Kevin? Oh, you are never living this down." Gwen snorted lightly. "Please, you lost your virginity to Charmcaster." She hung up to Jen, laughing loudly. Kevin sat up and rubbed his eyes again.
"You okay?"
he asked, slurring slightly. Gwen smiled at him, crawling into his arms. "Just a nightmare. I'm okay." She pressed her hand to his bare chest right over his heart, feeling it beat against her hand. He kissed her on the cheek, sloppily, as he pulled her fully under the covers, as though she was the warmest of teddy bears. He buried his head in her hair. She barely heard his next words.
"Want to talk about it?"
he asked. She smiled. "No, I'll be fine. Just go back to sleep." He shook his head into her hair.
"You need me."
She laughed lightly. "I really am okay." She could feel his heart beating under her hand, even as he started to nod back off. Jen's laughter still rang in her ears. For the moment, they were safe. She smiled and closed her eyes. Chapter 20. Secrets. A few quiet days put Jen on edge again. Gwen was twitchy too, but wouldn't say why. Kevin seemed more on edge too and kept shooting Jen looks when he thought she wasn't paying attention. But she spotted him doing it a few times and couldn't place the look. It wasn't distrust. But she didn't have a chance to confront him about it. They got a call from the team Jen had set to watch the Flamekeeper's circle. Vilgax was on the move. They might have had him too if the Plumber team had waited for them like they'd been told to. But they had managed to catch one of the Esoterica. Jen grimaced as Kevin pulled the mask off Squire Winston, the Forever Night Squire, who'd been with them when they encountered the Lucubra.
"Seems like you've been moonlighting for another group of bad guys."
Kevin and Gwen flinched back as the Squire's eyes flooded a sickly glowing mint green. Jen's eyes narrowed. The Squire stumbled and blinked, his eyes going back to normal.
"I need to report to Enoch."
Both girls raised eyebrows as Kevin grabbed the Squire by his shirt.
"You really think we're gonna let you do that?"
Jen yanked Kevin's hand off the Squire. "Actually, that's exactly what we're gonna do. Gwen, go home." Gwen stared at her cousin as Kevin frowned too. "What? No!" That was an order, not a suggestion. Jen took hold of the Squire and took off, using Accelerate's speed to be gone before either of the others could react. Gwen stared at Kevin, who shook his head.
"I have no idea. She's been acting weird for a while now."
He paused as if he wanted to say no more. Letting out a breath, he continued.
"Do you know a George? He's an old man, like really old."
Gwen shook her head. "No, Kevin, what aren't you telling me?" Kevin sighed, looking after the dust cloud that had been Jen and the Squire.
"Like I said, she's been acting weird for a while, so about a week ago I followed her. She drove out of town to this little farmhouse. She met up with an old guy named George there. I didn't catch a lot of their conversation, but they talked like they'd known each other forever. And he said..."
Kevin paused, running a hand through his hair.
"He said that even 1700 years can't change some things."
He looked up at his girlfriend. She looked just as confused as him. She shook her head. "That doesn't make any sense. And if Enoch's still around, we need to find him, preferably before she does. They've got a history, and it's not a pleasant one." Kevin pulled out his plumber's badge and keyed in the tracking for the Ultimatrix.
I'm sorry, which of the Forever Knights do you have a pleasant history with?
Gwen rubbed her head. She had a massive headache coming on.
Gregory, though he's not a knight anymore.
Kevin nodded.
Yep, retired to an old folks' home, right? Became a librarian.
He laughed slightly and motioned for Gwen to follow him back to the car. When they reached the warehouse, Jen had already met up with the metal-masked Forever Knight, and they were currently staring each other down. The knight's weapons were on the ground by Jen's feet, and Winston stood at her side, no longer wearing the mask, but still dressed as an esoterica. Jen was holding a dagger in her hand, Enoch's fingers still open as if she'd just pulled it from them. Let's not go medieval here. He had no choice. He's been under the control of the Dagon. She pointed the knife at the knight behind Enoch. Your boy Cyrus here found a seal that was holding an age-old demon, and his men decided that the best course of action was to bust it open. Anyone who was in that cave is a possible current servant of the Dagon. Kevin frowned as Gwen gasped in pain, her headache spiking. Then everything slipped away in a flash of minty green light. Jen's explanation to the Forever Knights was interrupted when Kevin went flying through several crates. A voice that was almost Gwen's echoed around the warehouse.
Correct. You are such simple creatures, so easy to manipulate.
The voice echoed around as Kevin scrambled to his feet, absorbing the concrete of the floor.
Gwen, you're starting to scare me a little,
he called out as the redhead stepped out from behind the stack of crates, glowing and floating. Her eyes were flooded a sickly minty green, and Winston's knees buckled as the same light flooded his eyes. But Gwen, or the thing that had been Gwen, paid him no mind.
There is a pretender.
Its snarled eyes scanning the group and alighting on Jen. They narrowed.
But one among you knows this, and more.
You're talking about Vilgax. The still-possessed Gwen nodded at her words, neither girl flinching at the sounds of swords being drawn.
He intends to steal the source of my power, my heart. But you know where it is.
The redhead reached out as if to touch her, and Jen vanished, reappearing in a small cloud of dust on the other side of the warehouse, having sped away from the others. I know where he was.
Heed me, Changeling. If your Vilgax acquires my heart, he will have all the power he needs to rule the universe. Return my heart to me.
Jen's eyes narrowed and she pointed the dagger still in her hand at Gwen. I'll find your heart and see it destroyed for good this time. Gwen shrieked in outrage and then collapsed out of the air, the unnatural light fading from her eyes. Kevin caught her as she fell. Jen flipped the dagger in her hand and threw it. It sank into the ground at Enoch's feet. Tell George I want to talk to him. With that, she vanished in a swirl of green, like how Gwen sometimes teleported them. Kevin blinked at the knights, who were blinking at each other. Enoch stepped forward. How does this child know the truth of the Dagon? Kevin blinked.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Sir Cyrus stepped forward, placing a hand on Enoch's shoulder. Peace, Enoch. They may be able to help us. Enoch grumbled, but sheathed his sword as Kevin brushed Gwen's hair out of her face. She was only semi-conscious.
Who is George?
He demanded, and Cyrus stepped forward. Are you familiar with the old legends of Sir George and the Dragon? Most cultures have a version of the story, but few know the truth. Sir George was a knight, most honorable. He served his king as all knights should, but defended the people first and foremost. The knight went on to explain the whole story about the knight sealing the Dagon. Winston piped up. So that's not the whole story. There was a girl? Rumors changing a story throughout the centuries, Cyrus snapped. Kevin frowned.
This would have happened about 1,700 years ago.
Sir Cyrus frowned as Kevin helped Gwen to her feet. She was back to her senses and looked more than a bit freaked out. How did you know that? Kevin frowned.
Call it a hunch. Where's George now?
Gwen frowned at him. He shook his head. He had a feeling Jen knew a whole lot more than she'd told them. She nodded slightly as Cyrus spoke again. He had been missing for centuries, but reappeared to us barely a month ago. He told us it was time to enact our true duty, to protect the world from the threat he founded our order to defeat. Sir Driscoll took this to mean we were to purge the aliens from Earth. But he was wrong. George disappeared several days ago, leaving only the runes in his chamber as a clue to where he had gone. Gwen nodded at the knight.
Maybe we can help. I'm good at runes, and I think my cousin may have gone after this George. So for now, I say we call a truce.
Enoch scoffed, but was silenced by a look. You are already dangerously close to being banished from the Order, Enoch. Do not make things worse for yourself. Cyrus barked at him and turned back to Gwen and Kevin. I agree. A truce, then. Follow us, we will take you to the runes Sir George left behind. Gwen nodded, taking Kevin's hand and practically dragging him from the warehouse. When they were in his car again, she curled up in the seat and refused to speak as they followed the convoy of Forever Knights.
She knew.
She finally whispered as they passed outside the city limits. Kevin frowned.
You think she knew that the Dagon could do that to you?
He couldn't wrap his head around that. If Jen had known something was wrong, she would have done something. But she had tried.
She's been pulling away from me ever since the Lacubra. When she found out Winston was for sure being controlled, she told me to go home. I should have listened.
Kevin reached out to take her hand and she shied away slightly.
Gwen, if anyone understands what it's like to not be in control of your own actions, it's me. Let me help. Please?
She stared at him for a moment as he kept driving, one-handed, the other still within reach. She took it and squeezed gently. The runes, left behind by the knight, turned out to be exceedingly complex calculus, using several sets of latitude and longitude as points to triangulate a new location. But the moment Gwen had finished deciphering the location, the knights turned on them, shooting both of them before either could act, leaving them behind to join their founder in his fight. Gwen managed to heal them both as they made their way back to the car.
We need to go after the heart. If Vilgax gets to it first, we're fucked.
Kevin nodded at her words, putting his foot down as they sped to the Plumber airstrip. Gwen was desperately trying to get a hold of Jen, whom they hadn't seen since she vanished from the warehouse. She let out a frustrated noise as she threw down her phone and Plumber's badge.
It's no use. She's not answering.
Two figures stood in the deserted state park. It was late, nearing midnight. They made for an odd pair on the trail, an old man in a button-up and slacks, and a pack on his shoulders. The second figure was covered head to toe in a green cloak, the symbol of the Forever Knights on the back. George frowned at the figure.
I do not understand why you insist on coming cloaked and disguised.
Call it a hunch that we'll have company that won't exactly be pleased I'm here. They reached the top of a ridge, and footsteps sounded behind them from a separate path that met up with theirs. George turned and frowned.
How did you know where I would be?
He asked as his knights, led by Sir Cyrus and Enoch, bowed. The figure next to George stiffened and lunged at the smallest figure in the group, prompting the others to go for weapons, but Winston stepped out of existence before they could act. The woman swore, her hood falling. Cyrus blinked. He'd seen the tapestry before, the defeat of the Dagon. It was said to be a representation of the moment the knights had been founded, or at least the battle that had inspired their founding. It was as if she had stepped from the weave. Her hair fell to her shoulders. She towered at 6 feet, and her eyes were flooded a deep forest green. Her features chiseled as though by an otherworldly sculptor, her face all sharp angles with no soft lines to be found. He'll go to the Esoterica. We have to hurry. Expect an ambush. George nodded. Enoch stood and pointed his blade at the woman. Who are you to give orders to the first Forever Knight? George's eyes narrowed. Lower your weapon or lose your arm, Enoch. The knight complied immediately. She is a very old friend of mine. It was she who sealed the Dagon after I cut out its heart. We must retrieve Ascalon now. The two headed the charge towards the faint outline of the temple.